And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
America has always been considered a world leader in agriculture. But in recent years, the situation has changed dramatically. Over the past few months, the United States has lost billions of dollars in agricultural contracts. And this is not due to natural disasters or wars. No, it all happened because of one unexpected and seemingly reasonable trade strategy. Instead of strengthening the country's position, this strategy has led to disastrous consequences. While American farmers are facing unprecedented difficulties, Canada has been called the new world leader in agriculture for several months now.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Almost overnight, thanks to stability and predictability, Canadian farmers filled the void left by American producers. Countries that had been loyal buyers of American products for decades began to look for more reliable partners. Japan, France, Germany, and even Mexico have all quietly and without fanfare begun to transfer their contracts to Canada. There have been no loud statements or protests in this process. It is as if the world has simply decided to turn its back on the United States and switch to someone who can offer more stability and predictability.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
But what caused this shift? Why did buyers start looking for alternatives where competition was previously unimaginable? The reasons lie deep in economic policy, which has put American farmers, despite their rich history and high production, at risk of losing all their markets. And while America continued to get bogged down in trade disputes and tariffs, Canada, as a reliable partner, seized the moment and confidently entered the arena, offering the stability that buyers around the world had been hoping for.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
Mexico, until recently the United States' largest trading partner, signed a historic $5 billion, 0 cents agreement with Canada. This was not just a deal, it was a response to the drastic changes taking place in US trade policy. And it's not over yet. France and Germany have signed multi-year contracts with Canada, redrawing their agricultural maps and abandoning their usual supplies from the US.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
But how will this affect farmers in America? How will they survive now that their products remain unclaimed and the market is becoming increasingly hostile and unstable? How will they survive the financial crisis when the country is losing the trust of its closest allies and Canadian farmers, despite the same global challenges, continue to expand their operations?
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
This is not just a historical event. It is the beginning of a new phase in global trade and agriculture. The United States finds itself in a critical situation, and the question is not whether it can regain its lost position, but whether it can ever regain the trust it has lost. The American agricultural industry has always been considered not only the foundation of the country's economy, but also a key player on the global stage. Just a few years ago, the United States was the leading exporter of agricultural products, generating billions of dollars in revenue. However, starting in 2020, the situation began to change.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The trade strategy adopted by the Donald Trump administration was supposed to strengthen the U.S.'s position in the global economy, but it turned out to have the opposite effect. Instead of regaining its leading position, America gradually began to lose its dominance in global agricultural trade.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The reasons for this shift lie in policies based on tariffs and trade wars, which place the U.S. in a tight economic framework, destroying long-standing ties with key partners. In particular, agricultural agreements that had previously guaranteed stable high export volumes began to collapse. It was a domino effect. With each new decision by the country's authorities, with each new tariff imposed on other countries such as China and Europe, American agricultural products became less and less competitive. It would seem that strategic pressure on other countries should have pushed them to make concessions, but in reality, the opposite happened. And gradually, the threat arose that America would lose its role, not only as an economic giant, but also as a key food supplier.
U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Over the past 3 years, the U.S. agricultural sector has suffered huge losses. American farmers, who used to be proud of their products, are now facing an unprecedented drop in demand for traditional agricultural goods. Countries that were once the largest buyers of American products have now begun to cancel contracts. China, which previously bought large quantities of American soybeans, is a case in point. After introducing tariffs to put the U.S. in its place, it sharply reduced its purchases, and that was only the beginning. France and Germany, traditional partners of the U.S. in the agricultural market, began to look for alternatives. Around 2022, France began signing long-term contracts with Canada, which led to a significant reduction in the volume of American agricultural products supplied to Europe. According to data available in 2023, supplies to the United Kingdom and other EU countries fell by 18%.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10% is really First of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Equally important was the instability that accompanied political decisions affecting agriculture. Uncertainty in trade agreements, unpredictable changes in laws and regulations, and inconsistencies between the federal government and local authorities forced international buyers to look for more stable and predictable suppliers. Unlike the United States, Canada did not intervene in global politics with the same zeal and continued to expand its trade ties with neighboring countries. Low export taxes, guaranteed government subsidies, and guaranteed product quality became the foundation of Canadian farmers' success. For example, since 2021, agricultural exports from Canada have grown by 37%, and analysts predict that this growth will continue in the coming years. Meanwhile, the U.S. agricultural industry found itself in a deep crisis. Instead of strengthening ties with other countries, America became increasingly isolated. Asian and European countries began to look for reliable partners, and they could not turn to the US, which found itself in limbo due to trade wars. Japan, which previously purchased about 30% of its soybeans from the US each year, signed agreements with Canada last year to supply nearly 60% of its soybeans. This was another blow to American farmers, who could not compete with Canada on either price or stability of supply. Thus, losses amounting to billions of dollars became part of everyday reality for American farmers. Sales problems became particularly acute in agricultural areas such as Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas, where millions of tons of corn, soybeans, and meat lay in warehouses without buyers. Prices fell, but demand did not recover. While American farmers, confused and frustrated, were grappling with a new reality, Canadian agricultural producers expanded their markets and gained a leading position. In 2023, American farmers faced another problem: a lack of financing. Banks began to tighten lending requirements, and many insurers refused to work with agriculture altogether amid the uncertainty. Debts began to pile up, and farmers found themselves in an economic trap. The rural population, unaccustomed to such difficulties, now faced the real threat of losing their land and businesses. Traditional government subsidies did not help, as they could not compensate for the loss of large international contracts that had been cancelled. Hard times came for American farmers, as they began to realize that the country had lost not only the trust of global buyers, but also its former leadership in agricultural production. Meanwhile, Canada, which had been quietly strengthening its position, managed to seize the moment and secure long-awaited contracts. Markets began to change their preferences. It was not an instantaneous process, but it became inevitable. The United States lost trust, and Canada confidently took the lead, despite all the global economic difficulties. Thus, the U.S. economic policy aimed at strengthening its national position led to disastrous consequences. Instead of regaining control, America faced the gradual destruction of its agricultural sector, which was once not only a pillar of the economy, but also a reliable partner in the international arena. Trade policy aimed at regaining control has actually caused a quiet but steady loss of the US's position in the global agricultural market. While the country continued to argue with key trading partners, countries such as Canada quietly and without fanfare came to the fore. This shift in roles would not have been possible without several key factors that played a decisive role in how buyers began to move to Canada rather than stay with America. The transition began with a sharp decline in trust in the United States. Countries that had worked with American producers for centuries began to look for more stable partners. Japan, traditionally one of the largest buyers of American agricultural products, essentially transferred almost all of its contracts to Canada. In 2023, Japanese representatives signed agreements with Canada to supply soybeans, which had been sourced from American farms for decades. This was not done because of price preferences. They remained competitive, but because of confidence in the stability of supplies and the absence of unpredictable political changes. The example of Japan was only the first step in a global restructuring, as buyers shifted their attention to Canada. European countries, including France and Germany, signed long-term agreements with Canada covering supplies of dairy products, grain, and other products. France, for example, did not simply redirect its purchases from the United States, but signed deals that will remain in place until 2026, allowing Canada to strengthen its position on the continent. All these steps were not the result of economic turmoil or sharp price declines, but rather the result of buyers' realization that predictability and stability of supply are more important than short-term bargains. While the United States continued down the path of tariff wars and new economic barriers, Canada seized the moment by establishing a flexible tariff system and removing barriers to international trade. Moreover, the Canadian government was able to offer much more favorable conditions for business. Against a backdrop of economic uncertainty and currency fluctuations, Canada consistently offered farmers support in the form of low interest rates on loans and long-term government guarantees. This not only provided economic security for farmers, but also attracted international buyers who began to see Canada as a much more attractive and reliable partner than the United States. The shift in trade flows was not so obvious at first glance, but it played a decisive role in changing global trade routes. Countries such as the United Kingdom and South Korea began to actively sign new contracts with Canada, and this continued beyond the agricultural sector. Canadian products became the standard for quality, and their supply was guaranteed, something that, unfortunately, America could not offer. The United States, in turn, began to lose customers and markets, which led to a sharp drop in exports in 2024. At around the same time, exports from the US to Mexico fell by 18%, and Canada managed to capture this market with a 16% increase in exports. This was a real turning point when the consequences of not only US economic policy, but also global shifts in preferences became apparent. The US banking system was not left untouched either. With the financial situation deteriorating, banks began to tighten lending conditions for farmers. Small and medium-sized farms, which had previously been able to rely on borrowed funds to expand production, now found themselves unable to obtain loans. Insurance companies, in turn, raised premiums, and some refused to cover risks altogether, adding additional pressure on farmers who were already experiencing a severe economic crisis. In 2024, farmers in western states, such as Texas and Oklahoma, faced a shortage of liquid funds, which led to the mass closure of some agricultural enterprises. Farmers whose farms were export-oriented were particularly hard hit. Products that had previously enjoyed stable demand on foreign markets were now left unsold. This was particularly noticeable in segments such as corn, soybeans, and meat, which were traditionally supplied to international markets in huge volumes. According to the USDA, corn stocks in the United States exceeded 450 billion bushels in 2024, a record high for the past decade. And with such a surplus of production, farmers faced unprecedented financial problems. The price of corn fell to its lowest level in a decade, and many farmers, especially in Iowa and Kansas, found themselves on the brink of bankruptcy. Against this backdrop, Canadian farmers continued to increase their shipments and sign long-term contracts, which ensured their stability on the international stage. Canada's success was not only due to financial support, but also to the absence of political turmoil that had accompanied American trade policy in recent years. Even major players such as Mexico, with which the United States had decades of trade ties, began to prefer Canadian product. When a new $5 billion contract with Canada was signed in Mexico City in 2024, it sent a clear signal to the entire global market that the supply chain can and must be reliable, predictable, and independent of political decisions. All these events underscore one main conclusion. Despite its aggressive orientation, US economic policy ultimately backfired. Instead of strengthening its position in the global market, it led to a loss of trust on the part of key trading partners. Canada, on the other hand, seized the opportunity to build stable and mutually beneficial relationships that became the foundation for further growth and strengthening of its position in the international arena. The situation with American agriculture continued to deteriorate. While Canadian farmers were strengthening their positions and international buyers were signing new contracts with Canada, American farmers faced unprecedented difficulties. Problems with product sales, contract cancellations, and reduced lending became the main topic of discussion in agricultural areas of the United States. Small and medium-sized farms, which had previously been able to count on government support, found themselves in a particularly difficult situation. While Canadian farmers were radically increasing their supply volumes and signing long-term contracts, American farmers had to contend with empty warehouses, high raw material prices, and an uncertain future. As of 2024, corn stocks in the United States reached a record high of over 450 billion bushels, while soybean stocks exceeded 1.9 billion bushels. This was the highest level since 2013, and as American farmers struggled to find buyers, their stocks became increasingly difficult to move. Products remained in warehouses while prices fell, and farmers were unable to cover basic expenses such as fuel, fertilizers, and labor costs. The problem was that the market was oversupplied, but there was simply no demand for American products.